What is sex education? In the U.S., there are two formats, comprehensive and abstinence only. Comprehensive sex education informs and instructs youth, some as young as 9 or 10, about safe sex and how to choose and use various birth control methods. It presents abstinence as one of the methods available. Abstinence-only sex education refrains from contraception methods and presents abstinence until marriage as the best option for overall physical, mental, emotional, and sexual health. The difference between the two approaches and their impact on the behavior of adolescents remains a controversial subject in the United States. For years, sex education was confined to the home, where parents served as mentors for important topics like adolescent development, puberty, and sexuality. Left to the discretion of mom and dad, sex was certainly not a subject of school curriculums. But from the sexual revolution of the 1960s, that all began to change. As the culture shifted, traditional ideas and perspectives quickly lost influence. A society once enriched in values stemming from generations of religious mooring began to accept sexual liberation as a cultural norm. Freedom of sexual expression gained a large following quickly. Its popularity ushered in an era of dramatically increased teenage birth rates, sexually transmitted infections, diseases, and unwanted pregnancies. To combat these increasingly tragic statistics, the federal government, under Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, established funding for sexual education programs. The goal was to implement a standard for educating America's youth on sex. To formulate the guidelines for this program, the nation turned to the research and findings of a controversial icon, Dr. Alfred Charles Kinsey. But first, let's rewind. Before he became known as the world's foremost authority in human sexual research, Alfred Kinsey grew up around the turn of the 20th century in a nation still firmly planted in its foundational roots. His father was an active member in the Methodist Church, raising Alfred in a religious home. The young Kinsey would become an academic standout, but childhood poverty and frequent sickness often left Alfred secluded, where he would spend most of his time grappling with urges of homosexuality and masochism. Alfred Kinsey would graduate at the top of his class and was deemed the second Darwin. A dedicated and well-respected biologist, his obsession with sexuality eventually led to the establishing of the Kinsey Institute in 1924. Here, a brilliant mind devoted originally to studying plants and animals would study the human animal and begin a crusade to change the world from what he considered its oppressive ideas about sex. Alfred Kinsey invested the greater part of 3 decades interviewing subjects and performing experiments to form conclusions on human sexuality. Part of their research involved extensive interviews with prison inmates, pedophiles, prostitutes, and young boys. Experiments were filmed and performed using children, interns, and even his own wife. Thousands of man-hours were spent creating detailed sexual documentation. And in 1948, Kinsey shocked the American public by summing up his research with 2 books. Sexual Behavior in the Human Male was published by Indiana University Press, followed shortly by its female counterpart in 1953. In his books, Kinsey made controversial proclamations. He argued that sex is the glue holding society together, that traditional sexual morality was worthless, and sexual activity at any age was natural, as children were considered sexual at birth. Kinsey kept detailed records that were treated as science, including the findings of how infants and preschool-age children were capable of multiple orgasms. Additionally, he championed the idea that humans were neither hetero nor homosexual. Instead, he created a 7-point scale between the two, offering varying degrees of sexual preferences. The books, which became known as the Kinsey Reports, were popularized by the media and quickly drew negative public attention. Though criticized for sloppy research methods, Kinsey's findings not only captivated a nation looking for sexual liberation, but they were regarded as the precursor to the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. In 1956, Alfred Kinsey died at the age of 62 of heart failure. But 8 years later, his legacy and influence would remain as the Kinsey Institute created SIECUS, the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States, as its educational arm. It was this organization that the government turned to for establishing a standard for sex education in American public schools. Its forefather was Kinsey. Its first director was Dr. Mary Calderon, a former Planned Parenthood medical director of 11 years. The aim? To become a driving force behind sexuality education and individual sexual rights. In 1991, the organization worked to implement the Guidelines for Comprehensive Sexuality Education, kindergarten through 12th grade. This work was considered comprehensive sex education guidelines for every grade in the public school system. More than 20 years later, the guidelines, now in their 3rd edition, are still influencing the minds of children in public schools. While the content has been edited over the years to consider age appropriateness, many parents still object to the curriculum. For example, children ages 5 to 8 are taught that boys and girls have different body parts and that touching or rubbing one's own genitals to feel good is called masturbation. According to SIECUS, these guidelines are not a curriculum, but rather a starting point for teachers and curriculum designers and can be used by local communities to plan new programs, train teachers, educate parents, conduct research, and write new materials. But other less culturally popular alternatives to SIECUS have also been developed. In 1992, Dr. Joe McElhaney, an obstetrician, gynecologist, and a Christian, established the Medical Institute for Sexual Health. Subsequently, he created a second set of guidelines called the National Guidelines for Sexuality and Character Education. He believed that core ethical values such as respect, responsibility, and self-control should be applied to the sexual domain. Other programs, like the Adolescent Family Life Prevention Program and the Community-Based Abstinence Education Program, to name a few, have been given federal grants over the last decade, but have since seen their support dramatically reduced or eliminated altogether. SIECUS has advocated for an end to all federal funding for these types of programs. On their website, they champion themselves as helping educators and parents keep these harmful programs out of their schools. It is a battle that rages on today, one that is rooted in the research of a scientist decades ago, and one that beckons the call for parents to get engaged and help preserve the innocence of our children.
Growing up, we had a woods near our home, and a lot of neighborhood kids would come and play. And one day I was out there with my best friend. He asked me if I wanted to look at some dirty pictures, and I said, 8 years old, I didn't know what to say. I said, sure. And so he was kicking around, I was kicking around, trying to find pornography that may have been put in a trash bag and left in the woods. And well, that day I actually found some. I found it, and I became a hero. It made me feel accepted. It made me feel like I had accomplished, being part of the gang, so to speak, being part of the group. I was actually starting a journey that would lead into 20 years of hurt, darkness, and pain. Later on, in my teenage years, I would do everything I could to find it. I would drive around, sometimes 100 miles, round trip, to locate it, to find it, to get my fix of it. I did that because I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want anybody to find me. I didn't want anybody in my church to recognize me. That was basically who I was. I was living two lives. I went to church, was very heavily involved in church. All the while I struggled with this addiction. In those 20 years, the best friend that I had that I introduced to the pornography came out with an affair. And it devastated me because I knew that the start of the affair could very well have been the introduction to the pornography that I found on that day. And I felt responsible. 2 months after the affair came out, I was processing all this guilt, all this shame, all this hurt that I had caused, not only him, but his wife and family. I went to him and I said, "You remember that day in that woods?" And he said, "Yes, I remember." I said, "I'm very sorry for finding that, for uncovering that, because that piece for me has been 20 years of darkness, and I know that it could have been a catalyst for where you're at." And with tears in his eyes, he looked up at me and he said, "You didn't find it that day. You did, but I planted it there so you would find it, and I told you where to kick." So I had to put aside my anger, put aside my frustration with that whole thing, and just forgive him. Because we were kids, but it was a very damaging thing for us to go through. It's not only affected my life, but it's affected my wife, it's affected him, it's affected his wife, and children. Redemption for me, I know that God has redeemed me and that Christ, through his blood, has saved me. But my heart is being healed because I'm able to help others now navigate through this addiction. I have the opportunity now to see youth in my youth group struggle with pornography and seeing some of the signs early on in their struggle to help them through it. When I see a young man come in and they're very heavily into sexual jokes, or they have a lot of knowledge, usually I know that there's something that's not right there. Many times parents don't have a clue when it comes to the actual grip that this can have on their child and the right questions to ask. A lot of times the parent will just ask a simple question, well, do you know about sex? And that's it. And the teen will say, yeah, I've heard a little bit about it. And then that's as far as they go. That was this case with my own father. I was 13 years old when I had the first question about anything relating sex. And at that point in time, I told him, I know it all, Dad, it's okay. And that was the end of the conversation. And I never really talked about it again. When it comes to warning your teens or having that conversation with your teenager and they tell you something that you don't really want to hear, the worst thing a parent can do for their child is to overreact, to make them feel ashamed. Just respond in a way that's loving and caring, and that you want to see them come out of that dark place, because the likelihood that if you do react, the likelihood of them coming back drastically decreases. The parent is the number one source for your young person's life in this decision. It's the number one source, and please keep that in mind.
Well, as far as my history, my grandmother raised me in the church. I had also a cousin that kept me going to Bible school and things like that. But as a teenager, I started experiencing some things emotionally, just feeling like I didn't belong or rejected. So around the age of 17, I began to feel that peer pressure to, have sex, to be a part of the in crowd, because my grandmother kept me very isolated, I could only do things that she wanted me to do or asked to do, of course. So around 17, had a boyfriend. From there, life just took its course. I lost my virginity at the age of 17, got married to him, and pretty much my life was kind of dysfunctional from that point, I would say, because it was just a lot of drama. As far as my being reconciled with my past, I feel like God is telling me, now you don't have to live in your past. You can be the authentic you, the you that I had created you to be. The sin, you washed from it, and now it's time for you to share with other people. I began to realize the importance of sharing or exposing my children more to what to avoid in life, should I say. Sometimes they're at a why stage. Well, Mom, why this? Why that? So I realized I have to answer those questions in order for them to understand history and avoid certain snags in life. In the approach, I was scared because sharing certain things with kids, you never know if they're gonna use it against you later in life, where, well, Mom, you did this and you did that, so I can do it too. But I really want them to understand that they can avoid certain things. The things that I stepped in, they don't have to, because, Mom did it and I know the consequences for it. The risk of avoiding the conversation with your children is, for example, I was at the age of 17. For the course of 10 years, I was lost. You don't want your children to be lost. In that 10-year gap, that was a loss of potential. That was a loss of purpose. It was, you're attaching yourself to soul ties and things you don't even really know what they are until you're, being educated on them. And it's time for parents to really, step up and be that first example for their children and explain to them the why of everything. Why, the things that they're seeing on social media, on TV, their friends even at school. I feel like as a parent, you have to have numerous amounts of conversation with your child throughout, adolescence especially, because it's not just a one-time thing, it's an everyday for a child, especially going through peer pressure and, boys start liking you. And, my grandmother at the time would just say no, but she wouldn't say why. She just would just tell me, no, you can't date. No, don't have sex. No, you can't go here. It wasn't a why behind it. And I feel like I've been taught to tell my kids why.
It's important to share our past and our experiences with our children so that they see some transparency, especially when you're not perfect, so that your children feel safe sharing with you when they haven't been perfect. I know for my daughter, she can sometimes feel like she can't tell me something, but I always reassure her, I'm gonna love you no matter what. And that's what your children need to hear, is in the good and the bad, that you're still gonna love them, no matter what decisions they make. For me, sharing the past has helped me also in healing to say, I didn't do it right, but I don't want you to go through the same struggles I did. I don't want you to have the same pain that I did of a first broken marriage, of making bad decisions, of choosing to do what I wanted to do no matter what. That caused me a lot of heartache, and I don't want her to go through that. I think parents are afraid to share their past because they don't know, one, how far to go. Two, they don't want to seem diminished in front of their children. And I think they're also afraid of what to tell their children. They don't know how to talk about sex. So as a mom, I've been able to share a little bit of my past with my daughter. I don't get into the details. I don't think she needs to know the details. I think she just needs to know that I failed. And sharing with her in terms of past disappointments in myself. I want her to learn from those things. I share with her what she's ready to take. Early on, when she's 4 or 5 years old, those are easier conversations. As they get older, they understand more. She's 12 years old right now, so I share with her how your body's gonna change, how feelings of like little flutters in your stomach are gonna start when the hormones start changing. You start noticing boys, and maybe when a boy touches your arm, because I felt those things, and it was exciting. And those are things that God's telling you, your body's awakening to being a woman and recognizing the difference between a woman and a man. And those are things that you want to embrace. Those are things that you want to celebrate. But the Bible also says, do not arouse or awaken love before it's time. So recognizing those changes in our body is good. That's God's gift. But now as a parent, I want to set up some boundaries so that we can make decisions, good decisions growing up, and wait for that right time.
It was almost natural for me, being a teenage father myself. When my oldest child was born, I was 19 years old, and I had not a clue on what I was getting myself into. But once his little face came into this world, I knew for sure I didn't want him to go through the struggles that I went through. We sometimes as parents are ashamed of what we've done, and we are afraid to have that conversation because we still know what it's like to be a teenager and to being approached about sex. Those barriers that we put up automatically, along with the shame that we felt of us not doing it the right way in many cases. It instantly kind of puts a wall up there. And then we also want to shy away from it. And sometimes it's just not always fear and anxiety. We just don't want to talk about it ourselves. And it's eroding our society, especially the Christian society, because that conversation is necessary. When you're talking to your children about sex, you have to make it a two-way conversation. Other than that, it's a lecture. None of us like lectures. You want to ask open-ended questions. Give them a chance to answer. If they shut down and don't want to answer right away, that don't mean they didn't hear you. If you get that awkward moment of silence in between, let it linger for a minute and then maybe come back and switch the subject on them. Because now they're still thinking about it, and they're going to think about it for a while. And bring it up again in another open-ended conversation. You can use music, or you got daughters like mine, they like food. And then you talk about that and you get into a conversation, sort of a volley, you go back and forth. That's what a conversation is. You listen with open ears. So long as you keep it open, they feel like they can come talk to you. So you look at each one of your children and you have to say, okay, how do they learn best? They're your offspring, so you think, okay, well, they all get it in a generic same way. It don't work like that. For instance, I'm a 14-year-old. He's at the age where he's starting to like girls. So the conversation is ramping up a notch from when he was just a freshman in high school. Now he's a sophomore, and he's this tall, good-looking young man, and girls are taking notice. That will probably be our conversation tonight. How to approach a young lady. And how to start a conversation with her, and how far do you go, and how far you don't go. It starts out kind of shallow. You don't start out as don't do it, but we prefer that you wait, and then you inch those conversations up to now you broaden that to how do you treat someone, how do you treat yourself? What are you looking for in a girl, And that's another great conversation we recently had. What do you like? Do you like to have long conversations? Do you want to find yourself in a relationship with somebody just as short as you? Like 3 words and we good? Or do you need somebody that need to give you paragraphs and everything? Whole thesis of their day? That's my wife. Have y'all met her yet? Okay, get the thesis. So you have to know those things early, and that helps prepare you for the long haul. So now we have my 17-year-old, Faith. Tell no lie, it was awkward. She do not like to share information. She don't talk a lot. She's very private, even in her own home. So that conversation in her mind was inappropriate. Like, Dad, why are we having this conversation? I don't want to talk about this. Why can't I just have a basic? No, we're gonna kind of dig into it to kind of so you can understand the consequences to this. And I'm always thinking spiritual when I think about the consequences. Just because your child is uncomfortable, that means you're just supposed to stop. You want to be respectful of who they are and understand that they do have feelings too. So, the hard line driving, the hard line sometimes don't necessarily work. It's just leaving a door open. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? Let's talk about this. And now my walls are down. I'm comfortable. Shoot, whatever you got, let's talk about it. So not only did I help break down her walls over the last, say, 4 or 5 years, my walls also have weakened some to now it's not uncomfortable for any of us to talk about sex.